The dust had not yet settled when Wilhelmina Hale realized she was the only soul left at the water trough, and the cattle were still thirsty, and her hands were bleeding, and the sun was beginning its long, merciless descent toward the horizon like it had somewhere important to be and couldn't be bothered to wait for her. It was the autumn of 1878, and the Kishom Trail had already earned its reputation as the great equalizer of men, breaking the proud ones, killing the careless ones, and teaching every last soul who dared walk its length that the land of Texas did not care one drop about your hopes or your hurts. The drive had come out of San Antonio 6 weeks prior, pushing nearly 2,000 head of longhorn cattle north toward the railhead at Dodge City, Kansas. And by the time that herd reached the Cimarron River crossing, there wasn't a cowhand left who didn't smell like cattle and regret in equal measure. Wilhelmina was 24 years old, and she had been riding on this drive since the first morning out of Bixar County, not because she had any particular romantic notion about trail life, but because her father, Augustus Hale, had suffered a bad fall from his roan gelding 2 days before the drive was set to depart, and someone had to represent the Hale brand. Augustus owned a modest but respectable cut of cattle in that herd, 137 head bearing the double H iron, and if no one rode with them, the trail boss wouldn't honor the split of the sale at the end. It was that simple and that complicated all at once. Wilhelmina had grown up on horseback. She could rope, she could read weather, and she could work cattle with the patience of a woman who had been doing it since she was old enough to hold reins. The other drovers hadn't exactly welcomed her with open arms, but they hadn't run her off either, which she had learned long ago was about the best a woman could expect in the world of cattlemen. She had earned their grudging respect over the weeks of the drive, working the swing and flank positions without complaint, pulling double watches when sickness moved through the crew like a bad wind, and never once asking for any quarter she wasn't willing to give back. There were 11 drovers total on the drive, plus the trail boss, a weathered man named Silas Burt who had more trail miles behind him than he had words to describe them. There was also a wrangler named Pio Gutierrez, who handled the remuda with a gift that bordered on the supernatural, and a cook named Old Harlan who could make a passable stew out of ingredients that would make a lesser man weep. And then there was Cornelius Prescott. He had joined the drive out of Caldwell County, hired on as a replacement hand after one of the original drovers had broken 2 ribs trying to separate a pair of fighting steers back on the second day out. Cornelius was 27 years old, with the kind of build that spoke of a life spent doing hard things, wide across the shoulders, lean in the hip, with hands that were scarred and brown from work rather than from war, which was something Wilhelmina noticed because most men his age carried at least one scar that had a war story attached to it. He had a face that was not classically handsome in any way that would have made a painter reach for his brushes, but it was honest in its features, a strong jaw that always carried a faint shadow of dark stubble no matter how recently he had shaved, deep-set gray eyes the color of storm clouds gathering over the caprock, and a mouth that seemed built more for thinking than for talking, though when it did talk, what came out tended to be worth hearing. He had nodded to Wilhelmina when he joined the drive, treated her the same as any other hand, and gone about his work with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been on enough drives to know that the cattle didn't care about your conversation. She hadn't thought much about him specifically, not beyond the professional inventory a person naturally takes of those they're depending on in tight circumstances. She knew he was a capable horseman, knew he worked the point position well, knew he never shirked when the weather turned ugly and every instinct in a body screamed to find shelter. She knew he had a bay horse named Soldier who he tended to with a care that said more about a man's character than most of his words ever could. That was the extent of it for 5.5 weeks, and then came the final day of the drive. The drive reached the outskirts of Dodge City on a Wednesday in October, the air already carrying that particular cold edge that Kansas put into its autumn like a signature. The cattle were trail-weary and so were the men, and Sila's Bert pushed them hard those last miles because he wanted to reach the pens before full dark. When the herd finally moved into the holding pens near the stockyards, there was a ragged sort of celebration among the drovers, backslapping and hollering, and the general release of 6 weeks' worth of accumulated tension. Silas paid the bonus wages he'd promised and told the men they had earned their whiskey. And they went, nearly all of them, peeling off toward the sound and light of Front Street with the singular focus of men who had been deprived of civilization for too long. The water trough situation had arisen because a portion of the Hale cattle, a dozen head including 3 that were showing signs of real thirst distress, had been separated from the main group in the confusion of the final push into the pens, and they'd ended up on the far side of a secondary corral near the trough, cut off from the water by a badly latched gate that had swung shut and jammed on its post. Wilhelmina had seen the problem and gone to fix it herself because that was who she was, and because those were her father's cattle, and because letting an animal suffer from thirst when water was right there wasn't something she was capable of walking away from. She had dismounted and tied off her horse, a solid gray mare named Juniper, and gone to work on the gate. The latch was an iron mechanism that had rusted and warped in the damp of too many Kansas seasons, and it wasn't going to move without encouragement. She worked at it with her bare hands because her gloves were in her saddlebag, and she hadn't thought it would take more than a moment. It took considerably more than a moment. By the time she had the gate wrenched open and the cattle moving toward the trough, her palms were cut in 2 places from the sharp edge of the rusted iron, and the rest of the drovers had long since disappeared down the road toward Dodge City's saloons and supper houses. The trough was a long, low affair built from pine boards sealed with pitch, fed by a pipe that came off a windmill-driven well some 30 yards distant. The cattle crowded around it with the single-minded desperation of animals that had been pushed hard for the last 6 hours, and Wilhelmina stood there watching them drink, her hands stinging and her back aching and her legs tired in a way that went all the way down to the bone. She should have felt triumphant, she supposed. 6 weeks of hard driving, and here they were. But she was standing alone in a dusty corral in Dodge City with cut hands, and no one to share even a word of it with. And the ache of that loneliness came on her suddenly and completely, the way cold water will hit you when you step into a river in October. She was pressing the hem of her kerchief against the worst of the 2 cuts on her left palm when she heard boots on the dry ground behind her, and she turned expecting to find Silas Bert come back for some logistical matter regarding the cattle. It was not Silas Bert. Cornelius Prescott was walking toward her through the fading golden light of the October evening, his hat pushed back on his head, his bay horse Soldier trailing loose behind him on a dropped rein. He had clearly started toward Front Street with the others and then turned back, because his direction was from the town side, and he was moving with the particular purposeful stride of a man who had made up his mind about something after a brief argument with himself. He came up to the fence and looked at her hands, and then he looked at the cattle at the trough, and then he looked at her face, and his expression shifted through several things in quick succession before settling on something steady and quiet. "Saw the gate was jammed when we came in," he said. "Figured someone would have to deal with it. Should have come back sooner." "I managed," Wilhelmina said, because she had and because stating that clearly felt important. "Yes, you did," he said, and there was nothing patronizing in it whatsoever, which was rare enough that she noticed it sharply. He nodded at her wrapped hands. "May I?" She looked at him for a moment, reading the quality of his attention, and found it genuine and uncomplicated. She held out her left hand. He took it carefully, unwrapped her makeshift bandage, looked at the cut with the focused assessment of someone who had dealt with plenty of wounds before, and then reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a clean folded cloth, so clean it seemed almost incongruous out here, and a small tin of salve. "Miner's salve," he said, as though he owed her an explanation. "My mother swore by it. I've found she was right about most things, including that." Wilhelmina watched him apply the salve and rebind her hand with a competence and gentleness that were not at odds with each other, and she was aware of something happening in her chest that she did not have immediate words for. It was not gratitude exactly, though that was part of it. It was more the feeling of being seen, specifically seen, not generally attended to, but actually seen as a particular person with particular needs in a particular moment, and it arrived in her like water arrives in a dry creek bed after rain, suddenly, completely, and as though it had always been the natural thing. "You turned back," she said, after he had tended to both hands with the same careful attention. He looked up at her from where he was recapping the tin of salve. The evening light was doing things to the planes of his face that were not entirely unhelpful to him, and his gray eyes had a warmth in them that the daylight hours had maybe kept better hidden. "Yes," he said. "Everyone else went on to Front Street. I know where Front Street is," he said. "It'll still be there." There was a pause in which the cattle drank loudly and contentedly, and somewhere in the distance Dodge City was beginning its nightly ruckus, and the smell of dust and cattle and October air wrapped around both of them like something physical. "Wilhelmina Hale," she said formally, which was perhaps a slightly strange choice of moment for a formal introduction, given that they had been on the same cattle drive for 6 weeks, but it felt necessary. "Cornelius Prescott," he replied, matching her gravity with his own and extending a hand that she shook, and the handshake lasted perhaps a half-second longer than pure formality required. "That is a very large name for a trail hand," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "So is yours," he pointed out, "and yet here we both are," she laughed. It came out of her before she could organize it into anything more controlled, and it was a real laugh, the kind that had genuine surprise in it, and she felt the weight of 6 weeks of hard, solitary work ease off her shoulders by some measurable fraction. He smiled at the sound of it, a real smile, not the polite, practiced kind, and she thought that if the rest of the world had been watching this particular moment through the fence rails of a cattle pen in Dodge City, Kansas, in October of 1878, they would have recognized it for what it was, even if neither Wilhelmina Hale nor Cornelius Prescott had quite gotten there themselves yet. They walked the cattle into the main pen together, working wordlessly in the efficient shorthand of two people who had spent 6 weeks learning each other's rhythms from a distance, and discovered that up close the knowledge translated immediately. Soldier followed Cornelius with the faithfulness of a devoted companion, and Juniper, once untied, kept pace with a mild curiosity. By the time the last of the Hale cattle were settled, the stars were coming out over Kansas in their cool, brilliant October numbers, and the temperature had dropped enough that their breath was just barely visible. Silas Burt found them there when he came back to check on the stock before heading to his own supper. He looked at the two of them standing inside the pen in the lamplight spilling from the stockyard office, and something crossed his weathered face that might have been satisfaction in a man less given to expression. He told Wilhelmina the paperwork for the Hale cattle was ready for morning, and that she should get herself to the hotel on 2nd Avenue, that he had arranged rooms for the crew. He told Cornelius the same. Then he left them to the night. They walked together towards 2nd Avenue, and the walk from the stockyards into the heart of Dodge City was perhaps a quarter mile, and in that quarter mile they talked with a case and a candor that surprised them both. She told him about her father's fall and his broken hip, which had healed slowly and not quite right, and about the Double H Ranch outside of San Antonio, where she had grown up watching her parents build something from nothing in the Rocky Hill country. He told her about Caldwell County, about the horse operation he had been building there for 3 years with his elder brother Thomas, and about how trail work filled in the income while the horse business found its feet. She told him she had been engaged once, 2 years prior, to a man named Gerald Whitmore who had decided 8 months into the engagement that a woman who could outride him was not quite the sort of woman he wanted to build a life with. She said it with a lightness she had worked a long time to achieve, and he heard both the lightness and the work underneath it. He said, "That seems like his particular misfortune and none of yours." And she looked at him sideways on the boardwalk of 2nd Avenue and found him entirely sincere. They reached the hotel, which was called the Drover's Rest, a 2-story frame building that smelled of wood and lamp oil, and the cooking from the restaurant attached to it. And the smells were extraordinary after 6 weeks of trail cooking. The woman at the desk, a Mrs. Cecilia Pratt, gave them their room keys with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been handing room keys to trail-dusted drovers for years and had seen every variety of them. She told them supper was served until 9 and that hot baths were available in the back room at 50 cents each. And both Wilhelmina and Cornelius looked at each other with the shared fervor of people for whom 50 cents had never sounded more entirely reasonable. They ate supper at the same table in the hotel restaurant, because there was no reason not to and every reason to, and over roast beef and potatoes and actual bread made from actual wheat flour, and not the hardtack variety, they continued the conversation that had begun at the water trough. He was smart, she discovered, in the quietly thorough way of people who read when they can get their hands on books and observe when they can't. He had opinions about things, about the cattle trade and its future, about the railroads and what they were doing to the frontier, about the treatment of the Comanche and Kiowa peoples whose land the Texas cattle trails crossed, and whose dispossession was being completed with a speed and brutality that he spoke of without euphemism or comfortable distance. She liked that about him considerably. She had views of her own on that subject, having grown up in hill country during the worst of the Comanche conflicts, and having seen enough on both sides to understand that the word justice had been conspicuously absent from most of the proceedings. "My father used to say that the land doesn't belong to anyone," she said, moving a piece of bread around her plate. "That we're all just borrowing it for a while. I'm not sure he actually believed it, but I think he wanted to." "It's a good thing to want to believe," Cornelia said, "even if it's complicated in the actual living of it. Especially then," he said. "The things worth believing are always complicated in the living." She looked at him across the table in the warm light of the restaurant, with the noise of Dodge City carrying on outside and the other drovers at various other tables, celebrating their trail's end with varying degrees of loudness. And she thought that this was one of the best conversations she had had in a very long time, and that she was not ready for it to end, and that both of those things were information. After supper they sat on the hotel's front porch, not improper, in full view of 2nd Avenue's considerable foot traffic, and she learned that he had grown up in Central Texas, near Waco, that his father had been a school teacher who had come west from Georgia before the war and stayed, because going back no longer meant what it once had, that his mother had been a woman from a Mexican land-grant family who had given her sons both her dark coloring and her absolute insistence on education. He had 2 brothers, Thomas the eldest whom he'd mentioned, and a younger one named James who was studying medicine in Galveston. He had never been to New York City or anywhere east of the Mississippi, and did not especially want to, though he allowed that he was probably missing things. She told him that she had been to New Orleans once, accompanying her father on a cattle business trip when she was 16, and that she had found it magnificent and overwhelming, and not a place she could ever live, but absolutely a place worth knowing existed. They talked until the hotel proprietress made a pointed comment about the lateness of the hour, and then they said good night in the hallway outside their respective rooms, hers on the left side of the corridor, his on the right, and the good night stretched itself out the way those good night moments do when neither party is quite ready for it to conclude, until finally the plain logistics of standing in a hotel hallway won out over the general wish that the evening might continue indefinitely. She lay awake for some time in the clean bed with the clean sheets, listening to the sounds of Dodge City at night, which were considerable, and she thought about the quality of his attention. The way he had come back, specifically, when he could have kept walking. The way he had asked permission before tending her hands. The way he listened when she spoke, not with the polite surface attention of a man waiting for his turn to speak, but with the full facing toward quality of someone for whom what you were saying was the most interesting thing presently occurring. She was not a woman given to spinning romantic fantasies on short acquaintance, but she was also honest enough with herself to acknowledge that something had occurred this evening that she would not be putting down and forgetting about any time soon. The next morning was the business of the cattle sale. She was at the stockyard's office before 7, washed and dressed in the clean shirt she had carried in her bedroll for this exact occasion, her hair braided neatly, and her hat set at the angle that meant she was there to conduct business. The buyer from the Kansas City Beef Company looked at her with the initial skepticism that all such men produced in the face of a woman conducting commercial transactions, and she outlasted it, as she always did, with the patient calm of someone who had outlasted it many times before and was not going to be moved. She had the papers for 137 head of Double H cattle, and she knew their quality and she knew the market rate, and she was not going to accept less than it. The buyer's opening offer was low by 18%. She put the papers on the desk between them and said, "Let us try again." And when they came out the other side of the negotiation 45 minutes later, she had received a price that her father would have been proud of, and she carried the bank draft out into the October morning with the particular satisfaction of work done precisely right. Cornelius was leaning against the fence outside the stockyard's office. He had clearly been there for some portion of the negotiation's duration, or at least for its conclusion, because he had the look of a man who had been waiting quietly and contentedly and without any impatience. "Went well?" he asked. "Extremely," she said, and showed him the figure on the bank draft, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to share the satisfaction of it with someone who would understand exactly what it represented. He looked at the figure, and then he looked at her, and he said, "Your father raised you well," and something in the simplicity of that landed squarely and warmly in the center of her chest. They spent the day in Dodge City together, which evolved naturally from the morning without either of them explicitly proposing it. They went to the General Mercantile, where Wilhelmina bought supplies for her return journey and a bolt of good blue wool fabric that she had promised herself if the cattle sale went well. He helped her carry the supplies to the hotel storeroom. They walked past the Long Branch Saloon, which was conducting its business in the daylight hours with a sort of brazen indifference to the clock, and past the marshal's office, and past the little frame church that stood slightly self-consciously among its louder neighbors on the main street, as though wondering how it had ended up in this particular situation. He showed her Soldier properly, in the daylight, the horse standing in the livery stable with his winter coat beginning to come in, a handsome animal with good bone and a calm intelligence in his eye. She showed him Juniper, and he assessed the mare with a horseman's eye and said she was built to last, which was exactly right and which Wilhelmina knew, and which made her appreciate that he saw it too. They talked about horses for some time, with the genuine shared enthusiasm of two people for whom horses were not merely transportation, but a whole subject of interest. And she told him about the 3 mares she had back at the Double H that were the beginning of what she hoped would be a decent breeding operation. And he told her about the quarter-horse stallion his brother Thomas was running on their Caldwell County place, and what they were hoping to achieve with him over the next few years. Over supper that second evening, the conversation moved into territory that was more personal and more pointed, because the general social contract of a second evening in the same company with the same person tends in that direction, especially when the first evening has gone the way this one's first evening had. "What happens now?" he asked, after they had been sitting with their coffee cups for some time. "For you, I mean, after you get back to San Antonio." She considered the question honestly. "I take the bank draft home to my father. I see how his hip has healed. I go back to the ranch work, which is considerable and perpetual. She paused. What about you? Back to Caldwell County, he said. Back to the horses. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. It's a good life. It's not quite complete yet. She met his eyes across the table, and neither of them looked away for a moment, and the word complete hung in the air between them with a meaning that they both understood and that neither of them was quite ready to address directly just yet. But it was there. It was absolutely there. I would like to call on you, he said, eventually, with the directness of a man who had decided that the particular pain of not saying a thing outweighs whatever risk comes from saying it. If that would be acceptable to you. Properly, I mean. I would write first, and come down to San Antonio if you were willing to receive me. Wilhelmina Hale sat with this for the length of time it deserved, which was not very long at all, because she had already known what her answer was going to be since approximately the moment he had rebandaged her hand in the evening light of the cattle pen the night before. I think, she said carefully, that would be very acceptable to me. The smile that came across his face was so genuine and so immediate that it made her want to smile back without being able to do anything about it. So she did. He left Dodge City 2 days before her, heading north and west toward Caldwell County with Soldier and the modest wages of the drive, and the memory of 2 evenings that had rearranged the landscape of his future considerably. She watched him ride out from the hotel porch in the early morning, and he turned in the saddle at the edge of town and found her there on the porch and tipped his hat, and she raised her hand, and then he was gone around the corner, and the morning went on being a morning without him in it, which she noted was a qualitatively different morning than the previous several. She rode back to San Antonio over the course of 11 days, taking the main road south rather than the trail, because she was alone and it was faster that way, stopping at stage stations and small settlements along the route. She had a great deal of time to think, which she used partly for practical thoughts about the ranch and her father and the coming winter, and partly for less practical thoughts about gray eyes and a particular quality of attention, and a man who had turned back from the bright lights of Front Street to come help her at a water trough. She arrived home on a Thursday afternoon in late October to find her father Augustus sitting in his chair on the porch of the Double H Ranch house, his hip still giving him trouble but his spirit intact. And when she handed him the bank draft, his eyes went wide and then wet, which was the most emotional she had seen him in years. He held her a long time and said he had known she could do it, which she suspected was partly retrospective confidence, and she did not hold that against him. She told him about the drive, about the final day and the gate and the cut hands and Cornelius Prescott coming back. She was selective in her telling. She was a private person by nature, but she told him enough, and Augustus Hale, who had known his daughter for 24 years and could read her the way he read weather, heard considerably more than she said. Prescott, he repeated in the tone of a man filing the name away. He's a horseman, she said, out of Caldwell County. Is he now? Her father said, and left it at that, which was exactly right. The letter arrived in the 2nd week of November, having come down from Caldwell County by mail, which in Texas in 1878 operated on a schedule that was aspirational at best. The envelope was addressed in a firm, even hand, and the return address was a P.O. box in Lockhart, the county seat. She read it in her room with the door closed. It was a good letter. It was a letter from a man who was intelligent and honest and who had clearly spent time on it, not labored over it, not polished it into something artificial, but spent genuine thoughtful time. He told her about Soldier's return journey, which had involved a lame shoe fixed by a capable farrier in Hillsborough. He told her about coming back to the Caldwell County place and the work waiting for him there. He told her about a morning he'd ridden out to check the fence lines and found the hill country to the west lit up gold in the autumn light, and had thought of her conversation about her father's ranch. He asked about her father's recovery and about the mares she'd mentioned. He asked, at the end, if he might write again. She wrote back that afternoon, a letter of equivalent care and honesty, and ended it by saying she would look forward to hearing from him. The correspondence that followed over the next 8 weeks was one of the great pleasures of Wilhelmina's life, though she would not have told anyone that at the time. Letters came and went between Bixar County and Caldwell County with a frequency that the local postmaster, a Mr. DeWitt, came to regard with a comfortable familiarity. She learned things about Cornelius that the conversations in Dodge City had introduced but not exhausted about the books he read and what he thought of them, about his particular theories regarding horse training, about the way he saw the changing frontier and what it meant for people who made their living from the land. He was funny in print, she discovered, in a dry and understated way, which she had suspected from the water trough remark about large names but hadn't known for certain. She told him things she hadn't said out loud to most people about her ambition for the ranch, about the loneliness that had sat in her since Gerald Whitmore's retreat, and the way it had calcified into a kind of self-protective independence that had served her well in practical terms, but was perhaps not the whole of what a life should be. He received this with the same quality of attention his listening had in person, which she appreciated enormously. He wrote in early December, "I keep thinking about that evening at the stockyards and how easy it was to be in your company. I have not found that to be as common a thing as one might hope." She wrote back, "Neither have I. I am glad you came back." He came to San Antonio on the 14th of December, having written ahead as he had promised. He rode Soldier down, a journey of 3 days from Lockhart, arriving at the edge of the Double H property on a clear, cold afternoon with the kind of blue sky that Texas puts on in December like a special occasion outfit. She saw him coming down the road from where she was working in the near pasture, his hat and the bay horse recognizable at distance, and she allowed herself a moment, just a moment of pure, uncomplicated gladness before she composed herself and went to open the gate. He dismounted and they stood facing each other in the winter light, and there was a half-second of the particular uncertainty that exists between people who have been intimate in letters and are now physically in the same space for the first time since the intimacy developed, and then it resolved because he smiled and said, "Miss Hale," and she said, "Mr. Prescott, you are dusty from the road," and he said he was aware of that and apologized. And she said she had seen considerably worse, and to come inside and meet her father. Augustus Hale met Cornelius Prescott in the ranch house parlor, and the two men took each other's measure with the careful honesty of men who both understood exactly what was happening and what was at stake. Cornelius was respectful without being servile, direct without being presumptuous. He talked horses with Augustus for an hour, and Augustus, who had strong opinions about horse breeding and was not easily impressed by other people's, found himself in a genuine and engaged discussion rather than a polite one. By supper he was addressing Cornelius by his first name, which Wilhelmina observed with a relief she kept entirely internal. Cornelius stayed 4 days. In those 4 days they rode the Double H property together, and she showed him the 3 mares she had spoken of in her letters good animals, solid quarter-horse bloodlines with sensible heads and strong hindquarters, and he assessed them with a professional eye and said things that were specific and useful rather than generically complimentary. They rode out to the hill country, limestone country west of the ranch, where the cedar and live oak grew in the rocky draws, and she showed him a particular overlook she had loved, since she was a child, a broad shelf of limestone that looked out over a valley, where a creek ran silver through the winter-brown grass below. They sat their horses side by side at the edge of the overlook, and the world was very large and very quiet and very beautiful. "I want to show you the Caldwell County place," he said, looking out at the valley. "When you're willing, I want you to see it." "Tell me about it," she said. He did, and she listened, and the picture he built with his words was of a place that was not finished yet, but that had the bones of something good. 160 acres of good Blackland prairie, the horse barn they'd built with hand-cut timber, The house that was solid and plain and needed things done to it that he had been putting off, because a house benefits from knowing who it's for before you decide too much about it. That last part he said carefully, looking at the valley, and she heard it clearly and precisely and sat with it for a moment of her own. "That sounds like a house that's waiting," she said. "It is," he agreed. On the last evening of his visit, they walked out after supper in the clear, cold December air, and he told her he was in love with her. He said it plainly, standing in the yard of the Double H with the stars so thick over Texas they seemed structural, and he said he understood this was perhaps more directly stated than the conventions of the time strictly required, but that he was 30 days shy of 28 years old, and he had never been good at saying things around the edges when the center was available to him. Wilhelmina Hale was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I love you too, Cornelius. I have been working up to saying it for about 3 weeks." He put his hands on both sides of her face and kissed her, and the kiss was warm and honest and certain in the same way everything about him was warm and honest and certain, and she thought, "Yes, this is the right thing, this exact and specific thing is correct." They talked until midnight in the cold December air, working out the practical shape of what came next, because they were both fundamentally practical people who understood that love without a plan was lovely but limited. He would go back to Caldwell County for January and February, continue the horse operation, and come back to San Antonio in March. In the meantime, he would speak to Thomas about the business arrangements, because he wanted to be able to come to the Double H with a clear picture of what he was offering. Not money, exactly, because they were both in the process of building things and neither of them was operating from a position of great capital, but stability, partnership, a clear and honest future. He rode out the next morning after breakfast, and she walked soldier to the gate for him. He said he would write that evening from wherever he stopped for the night, and she said she would hold him to that. He swung up into the saddle and looked down at her with an expression that was so completely itself open and warm and steady that she felt it in her sternum. 3 months, he said. "I know," she said. "I will keep busy." "I know you will," he said, and smiled and rode. The letters continued through January and February, and they were different now, warmer, more direct, freed from the preliminary work of establishing who each of them was, able to go straight into the ongoing life of two people who had decided on each other. He wrote about progress on the house in Caldwell County. He had repaired the porch and was working on the kitchen, and he described his carpentry with a self-deprecating humor that made her laugh. She wrote about the Double H's winter work, about her father's hip which was improving slowly, about the mares and a promising colt that had been born to one of them in January. She wrote about reading, about the books she was working through, about a newspaper argument she had gotten into with a neighboring rancher over water rights that she had ultimately won through the combination of a clear deed and a complete refusal to be moved. He wrote back, "I hope whoever argued water rights with you has recovered enough to eat solid food." She wrote, "He has. He is also now significantly more respectful, which is perhaps the more lasting improvement." March came, and with it Cornelius, as promised. He arrived at the Double H on the 10th of March 1879, and this time he came in a wagon with Thomas's wife Clara's blessing and a set of proper luggage, because he was not planning to be in Bixar County briefly. He and Augustus talked for an evening in the parlor, just the two of them, which Wilhelmina had specifically engineered by inventing a need to be in the kitchen. And when they emerged, it was with the bearing of men who had reached an understanding. Augustus shook Cornelius's hand for longer than a handshake strictly required, and then he looked at his daughter with an expression that contained so much accumulated love and hope that she had to look away briefly to get herself in order. They were married in April, on a Saturday morning in the small Methodist church in the nearest town, which was a 20-minute ride from the Double H. The congregation was small, Augustus and the ranch hands and their families, Cornelius's brother Thomas and his wife Clara, who had come down from Caldwell County for the occasion, the minister and his wife, Mrs. DeWitt, the postmaster's wife, who had become aware of the correspondence and felt a proprietary interest in the outcome. Old Harlan from the cattle drive appeared, to Wilhelmina's complete surprise, having heard about the wedding through the particular telegraph that operates among those who follow cattle trails, and he cried throughout the ceremony with a lack of self-consciousness that was both touching and slightly alarming. Silas Burt sent a letter. He wrote, "I knew something was happening at those stockyards. Always know. Congratulations to you both. Don't waste it," which was, everyone agreed, about the most eloquent thing Silas Burt had ever committed to paper. The ceremony was simple and true. They had chosen their words carefully, had a conversation with the minister about the vows, and amended the traditional one slightly, taking out the word obey from Wilhelmina's vows because she found it philosophically inconsistent with her understanding of what a marriage was supposed to be, and because Augustus, when consulted, had said firmly that his daughter had never obeyed anything that didn't make sense, and he wasn't going to tell a church full of people she was going to start now. The minister, who was a man of some flexibility, agreed. Cornelius stood at the front of the church in his best dark suit, which was good quality even if it showed the honest wear of a man who used his clothes in the world. And when Wilhelmina came down the short aisle on her father's arm in the blue wool dress she had made from the bolt of fabric she had bought in Dodge City the morning after the cattle sale, the bolt she had specifically promised herself if the sale went well, he looked at her the way he looked at things he wanted to take in completely, with that full, still attention, and she thought she had never felt more clearly seen in all her life. They said their vows in clear voices, and their hands were steady when the rings went on, which were simple gold bands that had belonged to Cornelius's parents, given to him by his mother before she passed, with the instruction that he give them to whoever was worth giving them to. That Wilhelmina was the worthy recipient of his mother's wedding rings was something that made his chest feel about twice its usual capacity. The reception was a dinner in the church hall, long tables and good food, and the kind of celebration that happens when people who work hard finally have permission to stop for an afternoon and be glad about things. Thomas Prescott turned out to be a large, cheerful man who bore his brother a strong resemblance in coloring and very little in temperament, being considerably more talkative, and he and Augustus got along famously over the subject of horses and land and what Texas was going to look like in 10 years. A conversation that clearly delighted both of them. Clara Prescott was sharp and funny and practical and pulled Wilhelmina aside within an hour of meeting her to say, in the direct manner of a woman who didn't have time for anything else, "He's been different since he came back from that drive. Better, more like himself if that makes sense. Thank you for that." It made complete sense to Wilhelmina, and she said so. After the dinner there was dancing. A fiddle player from the town produced himself along with a friend who played the guitar, and the evening had that particular quality of warmth and life that the best occasions in the West produced, people who worked hard finding joy together in a room that smelled of pine boards and candle wax and the good food they had shared. Cornelius was not a dancer of particular skill, which he admitted freely, but he danced with her anyway, and when he said, "I apologize in advance for your feet," and she said, "I have survived a cattle drive. I expect I can survive this," they both laughed, and the laugh carried through the room the way the best ones do, infectious and whole. They spent their first married night at the Double H. The guest room, which was larger and had a proper window, had been prepared by the ranch hands with a touching mixture of competence and embarrassment. And in the morning she was up before dawn, which was her habit, and she came out of the ranch house to find him already there, standing on the porch in the first gray light, a coffee cup in his hand, looking out at the Texas morning coming up over the hill country with the patient appreciation of a man who understood that some things were worth standing still for. She stood beside him and he handed her the coffee cup, and they stood together in the gray pre-dawn of the Texas hill country, not speaking particularly, just present in the same morning, and the weight and warmth and rightness of it settled into her bones like something permanent. "Well," she said eventually, with all the things that word was carrying. "Yes," he said, which was sufficient. They returned to Caldwell County together in May, after Augustus's hip had taken a turn for the better, and his recovery was clearly progressing under the care of a good doctor from San Antonio, and the stubborn insistence of a man who refused to be an invalid. Wilhelmina left the ranch in the reliable hands of the foreman, a steady man named Vargas who had been with the Double H for 12 years, and who Augustus trusted absolutely. The 3 mares came with them to Caldwell County, transported in a borrowed stock trailer behind Cornelius's wagon, Juniper riding, alongside Soldier with the philosophical tolerance of a mare who had been on longer journeys. The Caldwell County property was exactly as he had described it, the good Blackland prairie, the horse barn, the house that was plain and solid and had had work done to it recently, the porch repaired, the kitchen looking like someone had taken care in it. She stood in the doorway of the house and took a deep breath of the smell of it new wood from the kitchen repair, the hay and horse scent carried over from the barn on the breeze, the particular clean earth smell of good Blackland prairie after recent rain, and she thought, "This is a house that can be made into a home, and I am the person who is going to do that." She was, in fact, exactly that person. Over the summer and fall of 1879, she made the house into a home with the same focused practicality she brought to everything: curtains for the windows, a proper kitchen garden that she put in by hand, shelves for the books that arrived by the crateful from both her own collection, and the additions they made whenever they were in Lockhart or Austin. She learned the land in the specific, attentive way she had always learned the things that mattered to her. She learned which draw was the first to flood, and which corner of the near pasture stayed wet in wet years, and where the fence needed watching in winter, and what the neighbors were like: some excellent, some merely adequate, and one, a man named Cargill who ran cattle on the eastern section, who was neither but whom she managed with firm and consistent courtesy that he seemed to find bewildering and ultimately respectful. Cornelius and Thomas's horse operation was finding its stride. The quarter-horse stallion was producing good foals, and Cornelius had a gift for identifying which mares would nick well with him, a combination of bloodline knowledge and the kind of observational instinct that can't be fully taught. The 3 mares Wilhelmina had brought from the Double H proved to be excellent additions, and by spring of 1880 they had their first sales that could genuinely be called successful rather than merely hopeful. They worked together the way she had suspected they would from the first evening at the Dodge City stockyards, complementarily, with a minimum of friction and a maximum of efficiency, each knowing their own strength and trusting the others. There were disagreements because they were both strong-minded, and neither was given to deferring when they believed themselves to be right. But the disagreements were conducted with honesty and without cruelty, and they resolved because both of them valued the resolution more than the position. In February of 1880 she told him she was expecting a child, doing so over breakfast with the same directness she brought to most things. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her across the breakfast table, and his expression was so unguarded and so full that she felt the tears she had specifically decided she was not going to cry appear entirely without her permission. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands, remembering always to hold them carefully, and said something that she could not immediately repeat because it was so specifically addressed to her, to Wilhelmina specifically, not to the general idea of a wife or a mother, but to her particular self, and it was the truest thing she had heard anyone say to her in a long time. She did cry then, finally, briefly, and wiped her eyes with the practical efficiency of a woman who cried when it was warranted and then got on with things. And he stayed kneeling beside her chair with her hands in his, and let her cry without trying to stop it or explain it away, And that, too, was exactly right. The baby arrived in October, a perfect and furious boy who announced himself to the world at 4 in the morning, with a volume that startled the horses in the barn, or so Thomas reported afterward with great amusement. They named him Augustus James Prescott, Augustus for her father and James for Cornelius's younger brother now completing his medical studies in Galveston, and when she wrote to tell her father his name, Augustus Hale's reply came back within the week and was the shortest letter he had ever written to her, consisting of 3 sentences. "You have done a fine thing, Wilhelmina. I am very proud. I will be there by the end of the month." He was, hip and all, arriving in Caldwell County by stage in the last week of October with a cane he used grudgingly, and a new presence of sentiment that his old self would have found slightly alarming. He held his grandson for an hour in the chair by the kitchen window and spoke to him in a low, continuous voice about horses and weather and the proper way to read the sky for rain. And Wilhelmina stood in the doorway watching them, and Cornelius stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. Augustus came back the following spring for an extended stay, and during that spring visit he and Cornelius built a proper fence along the south pasture together, working side by side in the April sun, and the sound of the two of them talking over the fence work, the comfortable, practical, easy talk of men who genuinely respect each other, was one of the sounds that Wilhelmina filed away carefully in the part of herself where she kept the things that mattered most. When young Augustus, who was called Gus almost immediately and would remain Gus, was old enough to begin riding, it was Cornelius who chose his first pony, a small bay with a gentle mouth and the precise disposition needed for a child just learning. And it was Wilhelmina who first put him in the saddle and walked beside him with her hand on his leg, while he sat stiff and astonished at the height. And the look on his face when the pony began to move was something that passed between his parents above his head, with the wordless shared joy that parents carry for each other when their children discover themselves. In the summer of 1882, Pio Gutierrez came through Caldwell County, making his way north from San Antonio to Wichita with a new trail drive, and stopped at the Prescott property for a night's hospitality, as old acquaintances do in the West, where distances make old acquaintances precious. He was the same as he had been, compact and capable, and with an extraordinary relationship with horses that was fully evident when soldier, and all 3 of the Hale mares came to the fence to greet him, as though they had been expecting him. He sat at their supper table and told them news of various people from the 1878 drive, that Silas Burt had retired to a spread outside of Abilene and was reportedly in the best health of his adult life, that old Harlan had married a widow woman in Dodge City who ran the restaurant at the Drover's Rest, which Pio found both surprising and deeply appropriate. He told them that the cattle drives were changing, that the railroad was pushing south and west, and that within another few years the long trail drives might be mostly a thing of the past, which he said without nostalgia, just as a fact he had made his peace with. After supper, when Gus had been put to bed and Cornelius was checking the horses with Pio, Wilhelmina sat on the porch in the warm June evening and thought about the 1878 drive, about the girl she had been on it, not so different from who she was now, but less settled, less arrived, less certain of the texture of the life she wanted. She thought about that last evening, the jammed gate and the rusted iron and the cut hands and the sky going golden over the Kansas stockyards, and a man walking back toward her out of the amber light when he could just as easily have kept walking toward the saloons and the celebration he had entirely earned. He came back. That was the thing. Of all the thousands of moments in a life, that one, that specific, uncelebrated, unnecessary choice had been the door that everything after had walked through. She thought it was important to know that, to keep knowing it. Cornelius came back from the barn, having left Pio to his bedroll in the guest room, and came up the porch steps and sat in the chair beside her in the June dark. And she told him she was thinking about the last day of the drive, and he said he had been thinking about it too, that Pio's visit always brought those weeks back. "You didn't have to come back," she said, which was not something she had ever specifically said to him before in those words. "I know I didn't," he said. "Why did you?" she asked. Not accusingly or in doubt, she knew the answer, had always known the answer, but she wanted to hear him say it. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the June dark beyond the porch. "Because you were still there and everyone else had gone," he said. "Because I had been noticing you for 6 weeks and I had been telling myself it was not my business. And then I saw you still at that trough in the last light, and I thought, here is a person who is going to take care of everything and everyone and not ask a thing, and someone ought to go back." "I was managing," she said. "I know you were," he said for the second time in his life. "You always manage. That was never the question. The question was whether someone was going to come back anyway." She reached over in the dark and took his hand, and he laced his fingers through hers with the easy certainty of long practice. And they sat there in the June night, while Caldwell County's summer sounds went on around them, the frogs and the crickets and the distant conversation of the horses in the pasture, and the house behind them warm with the light from the kitchen lamp, and their son asleep upstairs, and the whole of the life they had built together sitting solid and present and real around them. "I am very glad you did," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." In the years that followed, the Prescott horse operation became known throughout Central Texas as one of the most reliable sources of quality quarter horses in the region. Thomas eventually moved his operation to join theirs more formally, buying a section of land adjacent to theirs and building a house where Clara raised her own children in comfortable proximity to Gus and the siblings who followed him. The first sibling was a second boy, born in 1883, whom they named William for no particular reason except that it suited him, and who arrived with considerably less drama than his brother and immediately distinguished himself by being the most tranquil infant either of his parents had encountered, sleeping through the horses, sleeping through the weather, sleeping through arguments about water rights and everything else. While his older brother Gus regarded him with the proprietary interest of someone who intends to have very specific opinions about a person for the rest of their life. Augustus Hale sold the Double H in the spring of 1884 to Vargas, the foreman, which was a transaction that took everyone slightly by surprise, including Vargas, but which Augustus announced with the peace of a man who had thought about it carefully and was certain. He sold it for fair market value, took the money, and came to Caldwell County to live, building a small house on the corner of the Prescott property where he could hear the horses in the morning and have supper with his daughter and her family 4 nights a week, and be a grandfather with a thoroughness and a devotion that was, frankly, the best of him brought out in its finest form. He lived for another 7 years, watching Gus grow into a horseman by age 6 and an opinionated critic of horsemanship by age 8. Watching William grow into a reader who would eventually vindicate every letter his parents had ever exchanged about books. Watching a third child come into the household in 1886. A girl this time, Cornelius's face, when Wilhelmina told him, named Josephine for Cornelius's mother, called Joe almost immediately. Who inherited her grandmother's dark coloring and her mother's absolute refusal to be deterred from any purpose she had set herself, which became evident at approximately 14 months and never stopped being evident afterward. Augustus Hale died on a Tuesday in 1891, in his bed in his small house on the corner of the property, with Wilhelmina beside him and Cornelius nearby, and the sound of the horses on the morning air coming through the open window the way he had liked it. He had been declining for 3 months, and the end was quiet and painless, which was exactly what he would have wanted, and which Cornelius had worked very hard to arrange, having corresponded at length with his brother James, now Dr. James Prescott of Galveston, about what could be done to keep the old man comfortable. James had come up for the last 2 weeks, which meant a great deal to everyone and particularly to Augustus, who took a genuine liking to the young doctor with his good sense and his obvious devotion to his brother's family. Wilhelmina sat with her father's hand in hers after he was gone and was quiet for a long time, and Cornelius sat on the other side of the bed and did not say anything because there was nothing to say, and he understood that completely. And eventually she looked up at him across the bed and said, "He was a good man," which was simple and entirely true, and he said, "He was. He was very proud of you." She knew that. She had always known it. It helped anyway. The funeral was attended by half of Caldwell County and a contingent from Bixar County that drove up in wagons, old neighbors and ranch hands, and people who had done business with Augustus Hale over the decades of his life in Texas. And Vargas came up from the Double H that was now his own, and the church was full in a way that said something true about a life well lived. Cornelius spoke at the service and said the things about Augustus that were real and specific, about his horse, knowledge, and his love of the land, and his particular joy in his grandchildren, and the way he had built something from nothing in the hill country with his wife, who had passed before Wilhelmina was fully grown, and raised his daughter to be someone who could build things from nothing of her own. Wilhelmina sat in the front pew with Gus, who was 12 and serious, and holding himself together with the concentrated effort of someone just learning that grief is a permanent passenger, and William, 9, who was crying openly and without embarrassment, and Joe, 5, who did not entirely understand but understood enough to be very still and very close to her mother's side. After the burial, they came home to the Prescott place, which was bigger now than the plain house Wilhelmina had first walked into in 1879, added to room by room over the years as the family and the business had grown, and the neighbors and friends filled it. And there was food on every surface and children underfoot, and the noise of condolence and memory and shared history. And Cornelius found her standing in the kitchen doorway for a moment between conversations, just breathing. And he came and stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back and said nothing, just stood there, solid and warm and present. She leaned into him slightly and felt him bear it without any adjustment or withdrawal, just steady, the way he always was. Years had done nothing to diminish what she felt when he was close to her. She had heard women say this was not common, that the particular quality of early love faded into something less vivid with the passing of ordinary days, and perhaps that was true for some, but it was not true here. The feeling had deepened rather than faded, had grown roots and history and the weight of shared life, and what it had become was something richer and more layered than what it had started as at that water trough in Dodge City, which had itself been considerable. She loved him, she thought, not in spite of who she was, but through it loved him as herself, as Wilhelmina Hale, who had become Wilhelmina Prescott without losing any portion of Wilhelmina Hale, loved him as the person she had been on the drive, and as the person the drive had not yet made her, and as every version in between and after. And he loved her back exactly the same way, and she had never doubted it for a moment. The horse business continued to grow through the late 1880s and early 1890s, adapting as the cattle drive era gave way to the more settled ranching operations that filled the Texas frontier as the railroads completed their expansion. The long trail drives that had made the Kisham Trail legendary were largely over by the mid-1880s, replaced by the shorter regional drives to local railheads that required less open range and fewer weeks of the grueling long-distance work. The frontier of Wilhelmina and Cornelius's early years, wild, open, dangerous, magnificent, was becoming something more organized and more populated, and they watched the change with the complex feeling of people who had known the old version and held it with affection while accepting that change was the price of the present. Gus went east for school in 1887 to a college in Missouri that Thomas's eldest had attended, and came back 2 years later with more book learning than he'd left with, and exactly the same understanding of horses he'd been born with, which was the correct result as far as his parents were concerned. He came back to Caldwell County and took over the daylight management of the horse operation, with the combination of his father's instinct and his mother's business precision. And Cornelius began, gradually, to step back from the heaviest physical labor in the deference to the shoulders that had been bothering him since a horse rolled on him in the winter of 1886. The shoulder had healed adequately but not completely, something that James Prescott had confirmed on one of his visits from Galveston, where he now had a successful medical practice. "You'll keep the use of it fully," James had said, "but respect the pain when it speaks." Cornelius had done his best to follow this advice, which was moderately more successful on the days when the work was not pressing. Wilhelmina had enforced it on the pressing days with the steady, non-negotiable kindness that she brought to the care of everyone she loved. And Cornelius, who was not by nature a man who yielded easily to limitations, found himself yielding to hers because she was right, and because the alternative was a worse shoulder, and because she had a way of presenting the case for his own care that made refusing it feel like an act of ingratitude toward her specifically, which he was not capable of. "You are occasionally tyrannical about this," he told her once, sitting on the porch while she retied the linen wrap the doctor had recommended for the shoulder on working days. "I am consistent," she said, pulling the linen firm and even. "There is a distinction, is there? The tyrannical are unconcerned with outcomes," she said. "I am very concerned with outcomes." "What is the outcome you're aiming for?" She looked up at him from where she was tying the final knot. "You," she said simply, "for as long as possible." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Then carry on." "I intend to," she said. William, the second son, turned out to be the intellectual of the family in the way that sometimes happens. A deep and genuine scholar who read everything, remembered everything, and had opinions about everything, delivered with the gentleness of a person who understood that opinions were not weapons. He went to study in Austin in 1892, drawn to law and history and the overlap between them, and came back to Caldwell County eventually, older and shaped by more of the world, to practice law in Lockhart and serve as the family's legal counsel and general argumentation, consultant for everything from property disputes to the contract language on horse sales. He married a woman named Ruth in 1896, a schoolteacher from Gonzales County who was small and precise, and absolutely his match in both intellect and stubbornness. And they had 2 children who inherited the family's consistent enthusiasm for horses and the family's inconsistent enthusiasm for listening to parental advice. Jo grew up to be, as those who had known her in infancy had fully expected, someone of tremendous force. She was 17 when she told her parents she intended to study medicine, inspired by her Uncle James and by a deep personal conviction that the health care available to women and to the poor and to the Mexican families of South Texas was inadequate, and that she intended to do something about it. Cornelius and Wilhelmina received this announcement across the supper table with the quiet thoughtfulness of 2 people making sure they were responding to what their daughter was actually saying rather than to their own surprise. Then Wilhelmina said, "Where will you study?" "Galveston," Jo said. "Uncle James says he can help. There's a medical school there." "Then Galveston it is," Cornelius said. Jo looked at both of her parents in slight surprise as though she had been preparing for more resistance. "That is all," she said. "You are your mother's daughter," Cornelius said, with a warmth that was aimed equally at both of them. Wilhelmina said, "You had better write to your uncle tonight. There will be practical matters to arrange and you should start immediately." Jo did, and eventually she became Dr. Josephine Prescott, one of a small number of women practicing medicine in Texas at the turn of the century, spending her career in San Antonio treating the full range of humanity with the force and competence her parents had watched develop since she was 14 months old. She never married by her own explicit and repeated choice, which she declared was entirely her business, and her mother, at least, understood this completely and supported it with no reservation whatsoever. The century turned, and the world turned with it, and the West they had known, the open range, the long drives, the particular wild, lawless, productive, magnificent, difficult world of the Texas frontier in its cattle drive years, was thoroughly gone, replaced by fences and railroads and towns, by organized ranching and regulated commerce, and the beginning of an entirely different American story. Wilhelmina and Cornelius watched this from the Caldwell County property that had been their home for more than 20 years, and they watched it without either excessive nostalgia or excessive disapproval, because they were people who had always understood that time moves, and that the appropriate response to its movement is to live the present well. They rode together still, most mornings when the weather permitted, out across the Blackland prairie on horses that were, by this point, the descendants of their own early stock soldier long gone, but his git still running on the place, and the Hale mares' bloodlines woven through the operation in horses that carried their quality and their sensible heads 2 decades on. They rode in the early light, the way they had ridden on the first morning of their marriage when she had shown him the hill country overlook, side by side and mostly quiet, because 20 years had given them the kind of companionship that is made of shared presence as much as shared speech. On a particular morning in the fall of 1901, the air had that October quality she associated specifically and permanently with Dodge City, cold and clear, and carrying a faint smoke from somewhere. They rode out to the eastern fence line where the Blackland gave way to the rougher limestone country, and they stopped their horses and sat for a while looking at the land in the morning light. She was 47. He had just turned 50, a fact they had marked with a supper of some magnificence that Gus's wife, a good woman named Helena from Seguin, whom Gus had married in 1893, had organized, and the whole family had assembled around the long table that was now necessary to contain them. Gus and Helena and their 3 children, William and Ruth and their 2, Joe down from San Antonio for the week, Thomas and Clara from next door, old friends and neighbors, James having sent a letter of magnificent humor from Galveston, expressing his regrets that his practice prevented attendance, but his confidence that his brother remained as capable of 50 as he'd been at 27, and that this would surprise no one who knew him. Cornelius was still broad across the shoulder. The bad one had settled into a permanent companionable ache that he and the shoulder had reached an accommodation about, and his dark hair had gone mostly silver, and the gray eyes had a few more lines around them than they'd had at the Dodge City stockyards, but were still exactly themselves, still that quality of full attention, still storm cloud gray. Still the thing she had first found extraordinary about him in the light of a Kansas October evening a long time ago. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, watching the morning light move on the limestone. "The drive," she said. "The last day." He nodded slowly. The gate," she confirmed. They had this conversation sometimes, not often, not as a ritual exactly, but as a touchstone, the returning to the beginning to check that it was still there, still as real as it had always seemed. The rusted iron gate, the cut hands, the cattle thirsty and pressing at the fence, the other drovers already gone down the road to Front Street, the particular quality of the light, the sound of boots on dry ground. "I think about it differently now than I used to," she said. "How so?" She watched a hawk cross the morning sky, slow and absolutely certain of its direction. "When I was younger, I was glad you came back mostly for practical reasons. The hands, the cattle, and then for the obvious reasons that it led to everything else. But now I think the thing I'm gladest about is just the choice itself. The fact that you saw a thing that needed doing and you came back to do it when you could have kept walking." He was quiet for a moment. "I could hardly have done otherwise," he said. "Not once I turned and saw you still there." "That's what I mean," she said. "That is exactly what I mean. That was you. That specific, exact you." She looked at him. "That's what I chose." He looked back at her across the space between their horses with the full, still, facing toward attention that had never once turned into anything else in all the years she had known him. And he said, "That's what I chose too. You at that water trough, doing the work that needed doing, already managing, and still the person I most wanted to come back for." The morning light was on his face, and she was 47 years old and had built a life of real substance from scratch in a country that had not made it easy. And she was sitting on a good horse on her own land beside the man who had turned back when he could have kept walking. And the hawk finished its crossing of the morning sky, and the horses stood patient and warm beneath them. And Caldwell County in October was about as close to perfect as the world seemed to get. She reached over and took his hand, the way she had on the porch that June night so many years ago, and he held it the way he always had, with the same steadiness, the same certainty, the same ease that came from knowing completely who you were holding and being entirely glad of it. "We should head back," she said eventually. "Gus will need the bay in the south pasture, and Helena is coming for the morning." "In a minute," he said. She smiled. "In a minute," she agreed. And so they stayed another minute, and the minute was everything. The land and the light and the horses and the two of them, and the whole long arc of the life they had made together, from one woman still at a water trough after a drive, and one man who had been the first one back to help her. And the world was very good and very complete. And the morning went on being a morning in which everything that needed to be resolved had been resolved, and everything that needed to be said had been said. And the only thing left to do was to ride back together across the Blackland prairie in the October light, which they did, side by side, as they had always been.